Critics always hate the films we think are great, but only one appreciates them all. He serves us every day, he keeps the trolls at bay, though he may be a shade delusional. The shelter of his mouth is moist, he will not give you any choice. Agree with him or else because he is the film defender. Okay, welcome to episode 2 of the Film Defender podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Dark Phoenix's disappointing box office numbers. I still haven't seen the movie, so I guess I'm part of the problem there. Also, we're going to talk about them delaying the King Kong vs. Godzilla movie because of the unfortunate response to Godzilla King of Monsters. I am also going to be doing a defense of Godzilla King of Monsters later in this episode. Then I'm going to be talking about my top 5 X-Men movies in light of that series seemingly coming to a conclusion. Have not seen Dark Phoenix yet, so that's not going to be put into my top 5. I don't know if it would, even if I had seen it. I'm guessing that it probably wouldn't, just based on the fact that it seems to be getting the worst response of any X-Men movie, even X-Men Origins Wolverine, so that's not super promising. Also, I'm getting slight vibes of the Fantastic Four film, just based off of the fact that they are reshooting so much of it, seemingly, so that does make me a little bit concerned. But I'm going to try to go into it with an open mind when I do see it, and maybe I'll be doing some type of defense of that later as well, depending on how I respond to it. So, depending on how justified their critiques are for the film. Let's begin with a discussion of the box office numbers for X-Men Dark Phoenix. So, according to Box Office Mojo, X-Men Dark Phoenix got second place this last weekend behind The Secret Life of Pets 2. And people are saying that this is a huge travesty for the X-Men franchise, and obviously it does not look good. The number itself is really bad, and it does not bode well for them ultimately gaining back their investment when it comes to Dark Phoenix. But the fact that it got second to Secret Life of Pets 2 is not an indictment on the film necessarily. The Secret Life of Pets did make more apparently than any X-Men movie has to this point, so it's not shameful that it didn't match that opening weekend. Worldwide, it's made $136 million in its opening weekend, so based off of its production budget, which is reported to be $200 million, it's going to have a really tough time recouping that money, I think. Right now, Deadline is reporting that Dark Phoenix is bound to lose $100+ million with Dark Phoenix, which is interesting because Disney has inherited this movie along with every other Fox movie. You would think that they would do everything in their power to try to make this movie a success, but it doesn't seem like they have much invested here, partly because I think that they're hoping to integrate the X-Men into their MCU, and might seem counterintuitive to try to put too much time and energy into bolstering what is clearly the end of an era with Dark Phoenix. So I was a little disappointed by the box office numbers and obviously the critical response. I'm a huge fan of this X-Men series, so the fact that it seems to be leaving on a sour note is not how I envisioned this series closing out. Honestly, I rewatched them leading up to this movie, even though I haven't seen it yet. I wanted to be prepared by seeing First Class, Days of Future Past, and Apocalypse. And honestly, part of me wishes that they had just ended with Days of Future Past, because that scene where Wolverine comes back to the future is a very satisfying endpoint for that entire series. So I've heard that they were planning to end with Days of Future Past initially, that they were going to do Apocalypse before that, but that Fox was wanting to get that story out as quickly as possible because they saw the box office potential for that story, combining the old and new casts. And obviously the time travel element and having Wolverine as such a prominent character, and also the fact that that's a pretty well-known story in the comics. So ultimately, I wish that they had gone that route, even though I do like Apocalypse, and I hope that Dark Phoenix is good. So anyway, that's my take on the Dark Phoenix box office report. It's interesting because Dark Phoenix cost more than X-Men Apocalypse did, and it's going to be making less. So we'll see how that goes. Right now, Forbes magazine is calling X-Men Dark Phoenix a Galactus-sized box office disaster. Obviously, it has the worst reviews for any X-Men movie, but also
it's just going to really struggle to be profitable. And that's a huge bummer. With a storyline like the Dark Phoenix, I kind of wish that, I mean, I've heard all the reports that they reshot the ending so that it's no longer in space, but now it takes place in a train. That's disappointing to me because I know that the X-Men Dark Phoenix storyline is very cosmic in nature. So them grounding it in a train heist sequence from the trailer is very much of a letdown theoretically. I mean, I haven't seen what the end result is, so maybe that was the right decision. They were probably just late to the party given what happened in Captain Marvel, and yeah, maybe it is going to be too similar to that, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Captain Marvel was great, and it made a ton of money, obviously, so being like something that was a success can't be a bad thing. You don't have to necessarily separate yourself too much just because it's similar to something that came out before. I mean, look at Civil War and Batman versus Superman. Those had very similar things about them. They were both about superheroes fighting each other in the same, 2-month span, 2 or 3 month span. So obviously, Marvel could have, tried to do something to differentiate itself, but it ended up doing amazing at the box office regardless. So you shouldn't necessarily feel like you have to shy away from comparisons and similarities to other things within that genre, especially if they're successful things. Okay, now on to my thoughts about Warner Brothers potentially pushing back Godzilla vs. Kong. I obviously really enjoyed Godzilla King of the Monsters. I'll talk about that later and more specifically with my defense in this episode. But let me first just start by reading what the studio chairman Toby Emmerich said. This is according to Deadline. Apparently he said, "The film will deliver for fans in the way they were looking for with Godzilla King of the Monsters. It might come out later in the year so we can deliver an A-plus movie." And apparently it's going to most likely be released late 2020. So first off, I just want to say that I feel like studios' insistence that a film has to come out in the summertime to be successful is completely antiquated and has been proven wrong so many times. It's frustrating to me when I see a franchise I care about try to release a film in late May or early June because they feel like that's the hot time to release movies. Yeah, it's the hot time to release movies, and you're going to be competing with 5 other big blockbusters that are coming out within a 2 or 3 week span. So you're not going to get the same type of eyes on your movie that you would if you released it during a slower month. So just look at Dark Phoenix. If Dark Phoenix came out when it was supposed to in February and they didn't make those reshoots, I would bet that it would make a whole lot more money because it wouldn't be competing with anything really. Just look back at Black Panther, making $200 million its opening weekend, and it came out in February. The previous record for that was Deadpool, $150 million, and that was a complete outlier for February. So I think that the rules are definitely being thrown out the window when it comes to release dates and what's going to be profitable for your blockbuster movie. I mean, before The Force Awakens came out, people were saying that releasing a movie in December wouldn't end up with a big opening weekend because the previous record for opening weekend at the box office in December was like 85 million or something like that. So people were skeptical if it could even break 100 million. And lo and behold, it made almost $250 million opening weekend. So that notion is just completely outdated. I mean, look at Solo last year. If they had delayed that until December, or even October or November, it would have made a ton more money than leaving it at the end of May like they did. For one thing, it was too close to the previous release of The Last Jedi, but also there was just too much competition going on at the end of May. People were still, in the wake of Infinity War, and that was just a really crammed summer with other blockbusters. And here, within a 2 or 3 week span this year, we've got Godzilla King of Monsters, we have X-Men Dark Phoenix, we have Aladdin, and we have Toy Story 4. Like, that's a really crammed few weeks, let alone Secret Life of Pets 2, which was more successful than Dark Phoenix. So studios just need to take a cue from Marvel and start exploring months of the year that haven't been tapped out yet. Stop trying to cram everything into the same months because there's only so much box office to go around. I know for me as a film goer, I would prefer movies to be more spread out. It's hard for me to go out and see all the movies I want to see if they come out within the same 5 or 6 week span. I want to go see movies all year long. So if a movie comes out in October, that's great because there aren't that many movies that come out in October or September or, January or February. Studios just need to be a little bit more daring, and I think that's really going to pay off for them if they're willing to take that chance. And I don't see how they don't see that as an obvious thing to explore. Anyway, I hope that what they're doing is just changing pushing the release date in order to give themselves a better chance at succeeding financially. But what I fear is that they're going to pull from the typical Warner Brothers book of making unnecessary reshoots based off of the reaction from fans and critics, like they did with Justice League after Batman vs. Superman came out to lackluster critical response and some fan backlash. Personally, I would prefer if a studio stuck to its guns with its storyline. I kind of miss the old days before studios had instant reaction from fans via the internet and social media to where it would alter their trajectory and their plans for their franchises. I mean, just look at Justice League. If they had just stuck with their guns with what Zack Snyder had envisioned for that film, not everybody would have loved it, but it would have had a higher probability of being great than if they had just settled for something mediocre, which is what they did. I prefer when movie studios are more ambitious and swing for the fences instead of just settling for an on-base hit, you know? When the best that you can hope for is just a single, then you're not going to have anybody that's a huge champion of your film. But if you swing for the fences and strike out, there are going to be people that still love the ambition and what they went for. Just look at Batman vs. Superman. I'm one of those adamant defenders that love that movie and wish that they had followed through with that vision for the rest of the DC movies, especially for Justice League. Anyway, hopefully the studio doesn't meddle too much in what they're envisioning. I have no idea what their plans are for Godzilla vs. Kong, but hopefully it's something good and they don't cripple themselves too much with trying to satisfy the knee-jerk reactions from the fans who, for whatever reason, didn't jive with what they were doing. So those are my thoughts on the pushing back of the release date for Godzilla vs. Kong. Okay, now it's time to get into my defense of Godzilla King of the Monsters. Objection number 1. The humans in this story aren't very interesting. Well, it's a tough task to make any character as interesting as giant, iconic monsters with which we all have decades of history. Everyone knows that the point of a movie like this is to highlight the monsters doing battle, and while this movie does that more than any other kaiju movie in history, it also has great actors doing a pretty decent job of making us care about them. This movie learned many lessons from the complaints that the first Godzilla movie garnered, and keeping its most talented actors in the film until the very end was probably the most impactful. Objection number 2. Yet again, this is a visual spectacle without any substance. Yes, this is a visual spectacle. It really annoys me when critics try to bring that up like it's a bad thing. Visual spectacles are what keep the movie theater industry in business. Getting a visual spectacle and a captivating story is an incredibly rare thing that critics unfairly come to expect from every blockbuster movie. Obviously, there should be a certain standard that these movies are held to, but the bar I've set for this movie was easily cleared. Does it deliver on the promise of the trailers by giving us visually stunning scenes of destruction and monster mayhem? Absolutely. Never in the trailers did I think this was going to be a hard-hitting drama that would get Oscar attention for its screenplay and direction. This movie leans into the fun of Godzilla fighting for dominance on this planet, and that's exactly what we should expect from it. Objection number 3. What's with the ecocentric themes this movie is trying to pull off? Just like the original Godzilla, which was an allegory for the dangers of nuclear weapons, Godzilla King of Monsters does a great job embodying and symbolizing the devastation we could potentially witness if we don't start to take better care of our planet. It tackles these themes because that's what's relevant for our time, just like nuclear war was relevant back in the 50s. Given the history of this series, I think it's safe to say there is certainly a precedence for making this kind of Godzilla film. Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, who was always a fascinating and frightening figure for me as a child, is a visceral representation of that struggle. Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, who was always a fascinating and frightening figure for me as a child, is a visceral representation of that struggle, and I think that creature's alien backstory and vicious temperament is a harsh but accurate portrayal of the mercilessness of nature and the forces mankind too often tampers with. Objection number 4. This movie is just too darn loud. I'm not kidding, this is a real and bizarrely common complaint about this film. What did you expect? What millisecond of marketing could have possibly led you to believe you were getting something other than what we got? Do people honestly think that we could have a movie about mountain-sized monsters and a melee for ultimate supremacy over mankind without it being loud? These aren't guys in suits stepping on model trains anymore, and with the heightened realism and fantastic sense of scale that CGI is able to accomplish, it makes complete sense that there would be an accompanying effect on the decibel level of such a gargantuan picture. Nothing is small or quiet when it comes to Godzilla, and nor should it be. In closing, Godzilla King of Monsters is a thunderous, cataclysmic, and at times beautiful film about humanity's utter helplessness against nature. The acting is great. Maybe better than a film like this deserves in some cases. The behemoth-sized brawls are breathtaking, and the ties to the previous films are done as well and as subtly as any Marvel movie. It's a great time at the theater, and I hope more people go and check it out. Godzilla King of the Monsters, updated status, defended. Alright, so that's my defense of Godzilla King of the Monsters. What did you think of this film? Did you have any other complaints that I haven't brought up yet? Were there better responses to these complaints that I could have brought up in my defense? Let me know in the comments of whatever you're listening to / watching this on, and I'll be happy to include that in my next video. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get into my top 5 X-Men movies. And a reminder, I've not seen X-Men Dark Phoenix, so that's not going to be included by default, not by choice necessarily, but here we go. So for number 5 on my top 5 X-Men movies, I'm going to go with the original X-Men. Now this is a movie that obviously gets a lot of credit for being the first major superhero film from the Marvel Universe to make a splash. Obviously there were a few misfires previously with Howard the Duck and Captain America and Fantastic Four. Those movies, Captain America and Fantastic Four, weren't never really theatrically released, so they kind of get a pass where this is concerned, and I'm sure a lot of people wish that Howard the Duck was never released. It's a really bad film, but this is the first legitimate Marvel movie that came out that was a box office hit and that most people consider to be a really good movie. It took itself a lot more seriously. If you look at it now compared to how a lot of the other superhero films have evolved over time, it seems really bare bones, really low budget, and it is. I mean, even Hugh Jackman is like a third of how ripped he ends up being in like Logan or the Wolverine or X-Men Days of Future Past. He started out a lot thinner and, more just normal looking buff, and that's kind of a good analogy for how this franchise ended up becoming more solidified and more legit over time, and some might say more bloated, but as you'll see with my list, I think that they do get better. Even though they started off on a pretty strong note with the original X-Men, there is room for improvement, obviously. One thing that they definitely got right, though, was the casting of Patrick Stewart as Professor Charles Xavier and Ian McKellen as Magneto. Eric Lensher. Their chemistry is great, and they do have kind of like a dark side, light side, different sides of the same coin type of dynamic, and their relationship does mirror, as it was in the comics, sort of the Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, sort of like the militant person that wants to go, and fight against racism versus the person who wants to push for peace and use non-violent forms of protest in order to try to combat that issue. And that definitely typifies their different approaches to this problem of mutants being vilified and discriminated against. It's a really interesting parallel, and I like that they brought that into it and kept that true to what it was in the comics, because it's a really powerful metaphor and mirror image of what our society is currently like still to this day. And not just with racism, but with other types of discrimination. We get all the main players here in this first movie. My wife and I just watched Dead to Me, and it's really interesting to see how far James Marsden has come. And this is the first time that most people actually saw him in a movie, was in this original X-Men film. I, for one, didn't know what he looked like without his visor on for years, because I'd only seen him in these movies. He does a really good job with what he's been given. Obviously, it's tough to emote when you can't use your eyes, but he does a pretty good job. He's kind of like that goody two-shoes character that always wants to do the right thing, but is kind of threatened by this new character, which is Logan, who shows up, obviously is wanting to steal Jean Grey away from him. But obviously we're all on Logan's side because we kind of saw where he came from, and we get a chance to kind of go along his journey. It's interesting that Rogue ends up being sort of the MacGuffin, what at least Magneto is after, and therefore what Charles Xavier wants to protect, because her power does allow him to potentially infect, quote unquote, all of the world leaders with mutantism, as it were. So it's a really interesting conflict, and I think that the way that they started out this franchise and established some of those really crucial elements like Cerebro and the mansion and the conflict and the Brotherhood of Mutants and all that stuff, they did a really great job. Could they have used some better sidekicks to Magneto? Yeah, probably. I'm not a big fan of how they portrayed Sabretooth. And Toad, despite it being played by Ray Park and he's got some cool stunts, it really was kind of a nothing part and his powers aren't really that cool. And to say nothing of the horrible line by Storm when she says what happens to a Toad that's struck by lightning. You can tell that's a Joss Whedon line. He was one of the contributors to this script, and sometimes his scripts are great and sometimes they're a little over the top with their, puns and their cleverness. And so anyway, I'm just glad that he got most of that out of his system before he got to the Avengers. So anyway, I think that's a great film. It's a low budget film, but it's great in terms of its conflict, its drama, bringing in all those characters, establishing that universe, and allowing us to have all the movies that came later. So Bryan Singer did a great job despite, all the allegations that have come out about him. I'm not going to address those. I'm just talking about the movies, and he did a great job in this first one. All right, my number 4 X-Men film is X2. This might be a controversial choice because for a long time this was the best X-Men movie, but there have been some really great ones since then that have come out. So I've just got to put this one here because the field is kind of loaded. But I think that the way that they followed up from that first movie was kind of like an Empire Strikes Back situation where they just stepped it up a level. The opening scene with Nightcrawler is an all-timer. Him going through the White House and just taking out all of the White House or Secret Service people who are in charge of protecting the president, just completely wipes them all out. They don't even stand a chance. And he almost takes out the president before he's, taken down or at least stopped. He eventually does teleport away, but he's within a second of assassinating the president. And obviously we find out later that that's wasn't what he wanted. He was being controlled. Nightcrawler is one of the coolest new mutants to be portrayed in this series, and he's played really well by Alan Cumming too. Some of the other new characters that we get are William Stryker. And this is kind of a cool movie because it brings in Wolverine's origins. We'll see this portrayed in a much worse way later with X-Men Origins Wolverine, but here is where they do a great job of bringing it in and, making it something subtle but also powerful in terms of where Logan came from and where he's going and his character evolution. This is where they bring in the iconic score for the X-Men series, the da-da-da-da-da thing. But that scene where Wolverine takes out all of those soldiers who are coming in to try to abduct the students is so awesome. Sort of a hint of what's to come with Logan, and obviously it's not as brutally violent, but it does have sort of that implied sense of brutality. And it's interesting to see kind of where Bobby comes from. You get to see his family, and it approaches that mutant conversation from a more personal standpoint and how it affects the family. That's something that we hadn't seen to this point. And then Pyro seeing the extent of his powers as he takes out all those police vehicles. One thing you can tell right off the bat is that this movie has a much bigger budget than the first X-Men, and they use it to their advantage, and not too much. I will grant you that all the tornadoes coming in from Storm might be a bit excessive, but it is really cool to see her use her powers like that, even if they don't quite hold up looking at it in 2019. But, the movie came out 16 years ago, so I'm not going to hold that too much against it. I love the fact that they're forced to unite with Magneto and his people. This is a movie that really highlights Mystique as well. She gets a lot to do, and she does a really great job. She's the one who's responsible for releasing Magneto from his plastic prison, and without her, they probably couldn't have gotten into the facility. Stryker's son. That's a really sad storyline, but it just goes to show how far he'll go to try to get rid of this virus or this infection that he sees, It's like the other side of the militant action that Magneto was trying to take in the last movie. He wants to kill all the mutants here, whereas Magneto wanted to make everybody mutants, but would have ended up killing them in the process. So it's a good kind of mirror image of that, and kind of taking a new stance on it while also keeping it within the same vein as what had already happened and making it relatable and familiar in that way. And then obviously the big tease at the end with Jean Grey. And a lot of people say, well, she didn't have to die in this scene. She could have gotten them out without having to sacrifice herself. But I think that she wanted to kind of explore the extent of her powers and kind of see where that would take her. I don't know if it was necessarily a sacrificial move per se, but this whole time she's been kind of battling with this power within her, and she wanted to see where it would take her because she, was starting to glow there at the end, and I think that she just wanted to embrace it for once rather than trying to keep it under wraps. So that's my take on the ending anyway. But I think it was a really great movie and an awesome way to step it up and improve what they had already done pretty well the first go around. One of the rare cases where the sequel improves. But it's not as rare anymore because a lot of films are able to do that since then. My number 3 X-Men film is going to be X-Men First Class. This is an awesome, awesome movie. I love the backstory that we get for Professor Xavier and Eric and seeing their friendship sort of take root and blossom, and their conflict too kind of subtly develops over the course of the film, and the way that they write these two and how they grow apart throughout the film is really expertly done. The acting is incredible too. James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender are incredible actors, and I'm glad that they were able to bring them back for the later movies, because if you're going to find people that can at least bring the same level of gravitas and just overall acting skill, it's hard to find anybody better than those two, in my opinion. It's really interesting to see some of the things that they bring in. I mean, obviously, the X-Men series is notorious for having some problems with their timeline and, continuity not being quite right. But if you put all that aside and just recognize the movie for what it is and how good it is, then you can't help but appreciate its profound impact on the series, but also just the awesome story that it's telling. I love how they bring in those real world histories with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I really like Kevin Bacon. This is the first time I've seen him in a villainous role, and he does a great job. Kind of reinvigorated his career for a little while. The score is awesome. It might be a little reminiscent of Inception at times, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Henry Jackman has gone on to do some awesome scores, so I'm glad that he got a chance to really shine in this film. And yeah, I left this movie really, really excited for the sequel. But before I talk about that, let's talk about my number 2 X-Men film, which is Logan. Now, this is directed by James Mangold. He's done films like 3:10 to Yuma. He did the last Wolverine film, which is so interesting because they're so different. One's like this kind of futuristic-y, a little bit more formulaic superhero film that is really good up until the last act where it goes a little crazy with the samurai and the CGI in that scene. But here it's like this gritty Western vibe. It's just so interesting to see like this dystopian future in the X-Men series and kind of seeing how, it's all kind of grim, and, Logan's trying to just live a normal life, kind of working as like a taxi driver while his adamantium skeleton is slowly poisoning him and his healing ability is weakened. And I really like that they brought back Professor Xavier and to see kind of how far he's fallen and him going through his struggles with dementia and seizures that he's had that have killed all those mutants. It's a really interesting personal journey and more dramatic and more of like a character study than it is like a plot-driven movie. But it does have a good plot at the same time, bringing in Lara, who ends up being X-23. Daphne Keane does such a good job in this movie, and I hope that they bring her into, some type of movie in the future where she can kind of do her own thing as like a new Wolverine. But anyway, the whole aesthetic of this film, the grittiness of it, the more mature nature of the film itself, and just how it puts this bow on Logan's whole story is just awesome. And it's so cool to see a superhero movie delve into this type of territory where it's never been before. So it was kind of a game changer, and it did so well at the box office that I kind of hope that they are more willing to take chances like this. So yeah, number 2 is Logan. And my number one choice, I know a lot of people probably would have put Logan number one, but for me, my number one choice is still X-Men Days of Future Past. For me, this is like a top 5 superhero film. I love how you bring in both sets of casts that they've had from the new trilogy and the old, X-Men trilogy, having Wolverine kind of uniting the two because he is the one that ages so slowly. I thought that was a really brilliant mechanism for that. In a way, it probably should have ended with this movie, but I love how they just decided to go for it at the same time, because who knows if we would have ended up getting it, and what if it wasn't as high quality as it ended up being. So I would prefer them to have made such a good version of this movie rather than waiting until maybe the best time to release it, because they were coming off such a strong movie with X-Men First Class that they had everybody's buy-in, and it was just the right opportunity to bring it about. And obviously it worked because it was so good. The Sentinels in that dystopian future are terrifying. Seeing them just take out all of the mutants is really foreboding and ominous, obviously, and it makes you see how dire their situation really is and why this is such a drastic measure has to be taken to send Logan back into the past to fix it. I love where we see our characters having evolved and seeing how, like, the Vietnam War has affected them. They just did a really good job with that. Magneto lifting the baseball stadium over the White House is still an iconic shot. I love that Mystique kind of gets her opportunity to change and really become her own person, and that she's allowed to make the choice to save the people and kind of overcome that bias that Eric has instilled in her. It's just a great film. I love the interaction. This is where we get Quicksilver for the first time, and he's awesome. One of my favorite X-Men. Let's go back through the top 5. So, number 5 is the original X-Men. I kind of spent less time on each film as I went along because I realized I was being a little long-winded. So, number 5 is the original X-Men. Number 4 is X2. Number 3 is X-Men First Class. Number 2 is Logan. And number 1 is X-Men Days of Future Past. So I will be posting an update of some kind after I've seen X-Men Dark Phoenix, and maybe I'll come to that film's defense, maybe not. We'll have to wait and see. What are your top 5 X-Men movies? How would you rank them? Would you have put the same films but a different order? Would it be completely different? Let me know in the comments of whatever you're watching/listening to this on, and I will be happy to go through them. So for the last part of this, I'm just going to read some more fan comments and questions. So here we go. Fear of Ravens is curious what I thought of Dark Phoenix. I have not seen it, as I've mentioned about 20 times in this episode. Anyway, Ozzy, the MLG Pro, also wants to know if I'm going to do a Dark Phoenix defense. I am going to see it, and then hopefully I'll do it. So thanks for the comment. 1234 Murph Dog wants me to defend Captain Marvel. Not sure if that one quite needs a defense. It did earn $1 billion at the box office and has mostly been positive, but I will consider it because I really like that movie too. I love the 90s aesthetic of it. Let's see. Closer Chief commented on the Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End and said one of the best sequels of all time, and it gets none of the credit. Yeah, I think that is a very underrated sequel, and I especially love the score. I think that it's just a really underrated film in general. So thanks for the comment there, Closer Chief. Wavy Kellen said about my defense of Batman and Robin, which it wasn't really a defense. If you go and watch that video, it's kind of a April Fool's prank, but he said it's funny and nostalgic. I still like to watch it every now and then. LOL. And I get that. I have movies like that are completely just guilty pleasures that I watch for nostalgia, so I'm not gonna fault you for that. So thanks for the comment, Wavy Kellen. Okay, AK Productions with a Z said greatest trilogy of all time to my video about defending Return of the King's epilogue, and honestly I have to say I agree. I mean, there are a lot of great trilogies out there. Star Wars trilogy, Toy Story trilogy, the Planet of the Apes trilogy is up there, obviously the Godfather trilogy. Most of them have like one film that kind of stands out as kind of a dud. The Dark Knight trilogy is amazing, but for me, the best trilogy of all time is still Lord of the Rings. Every one of them is just such high quality, and you get to know and love the characters so much, and you go on their journey. It's so emotionally satisfying. Yeah, I don't think that one will ever be topped in my opinion. So thank you for the comment. Okay, Andrew Dickerson said on my defense of the Justice League movie, do Iron Man 2 next. Obviously, I didn't do Iron Man 2 next, but I have thought about doing that one. It is a really good movie. I loved it when it first came out, so I would definitely not be opposed to defending it because I feel like it is a little bit unfairly criticized. So thank you for the comment, Andrew Dickerson. Okay, the Maniacal Force Wielder says, defend Batman Begins next, please. I love Batman Begins. I think the Dark Knight trilogy is like a top 3 trilogy of all time, but I don't know that it needs defending. I really don't even know what the major criticisms of that movie would be. So maybe just the science behind the microwave emitter, but I mean, that's just kind of a, you just gonna go with it or you don't type of thing. So anyway, but if you can think of some critiques of that film that need to be addressed, then let me know. West Tech Media asks, are you Batman? This is on my rave session Inception video where I just go on and praise Inception to the heavens because I love that movie so much. Yes, I am Batman. You got me. For those of you who are just listening to the podcast, my videos on YouTube usually feature me wearing this homemade mask and cape and stuff, so that's what he's referencing. But anyway, thanks for the comment, West Tech Media. Okay, 1234 Murph Dog says, defend the Lost World Jurassic Park. That one, there are plenty of complaints about, so that's something I might have to consider. Actually, I've considered it before, but I felt like Jurassic World, the first one, was a more worthy defense. And I'll probably do Fallen Kingdom before I do The Lost World, but The Lost World is definitely one to think about, so I appreciate the suggestion, 1234 Murph Dog. Okay, the Maniacal Force Wielder asks, was there anything you liked about On Stranger Tides? Yeah, there was a lot that I liked about On Stranger Tides, actually. I think the opening sequence of them going through London is really fun. I think that the whole focus on Jack Sparrow, it was a good move. I could do a whole video about On Stranger Tides. It's not my favorite of the Pirates movies, but there are definitely some good things about it. I really like the score, especially the mermaids theme. I like that it's more practical. It's not quite so CGI heavy. So thanks for the question, the Maniacal Force Wielder. Okay, Eric Naylor says, this is definitely my favorite DCEU film to date, talking about my defense of Justice League. Now, it's interesting. This is one of the reasons why I created the Film Defenders, because every movie is precious to somebody. Everybody loves a certain movie, regardless of what the overall public opinion is of that film. So that's why I always say that every movie deserves a defense. So I'm glad that this is your favorite film in the DCEU, Eric Naylor. I really liked it too, even though I feel like it could have been better. Yeah, I'm glad that you really liked it. For me, my favorite DCEU film is probably either Man of Steel or Batman vs. Superman. Obviously, I love Wonder Woman too. And thanks for the comment. Okay, Nexus Shark asks if I will do a video for Alien Covenant. That's one that I've thought about doing for sure. Alien Covenant definitely has some good moments. It's obviously not a perfect movie, but I like that they got back to the actual alien and sort of progressed that storyline from Prometheus. Doesn't have the same thematic elements as Prometheus, and it's not quite as cerebral of a film, but it's much more horrific and scary, definitely more gory of a film, but I definitely liked it, so I would be up for doing a defense. Thank you for your comment. All right, well, I think that's going to do it for this episode of the Film Defender podcast. As always, remember to subscribe on YouTube, on Podbean. I'm going to try to get these podcasts on iTunes and some other platforms as well, so just search it on Google and hopefully you'll find a platform where you can listen to it. Be sure to comment with questions if you want them to be read on the next episode, and I'll be happy to go through them. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you guys next time. Thank you for listening to the Film Defender podcast. Please remember to like and subscribe us on YouTube, follow us on Podbean, and rate and review us on iTunes so that other listeners can find us. We appreciate your support, and until next time, the defense rests.